In this video, I'm going to cover Trace Logging 101. It's important to note that trace logging and audit logging are two different things within VIS. We'll cover audit logging in a separate one, and that's basically covering all audit perspectives, such as searches, modifications, authentications that come through the VIS server. What tracing is in VIS is basically what the product itself is doing. So we can trace at multiple levels, whether that's fatal, where I just want to know real bad problems, errors, any errors or warnings, as well as all the way up to debug. Debug is pretty much a stack trace of everything VIS is doing. So let's go take a look at a couple of things. First thing, by default, all the applications are going to store their tracing information to this trace logging folder. It is configurable, and you can choose to send it to different places if you'd like. And what this would do is all the logs for the different applications. You can notice we have VIS server logs here, and we have also logs from LDAP Manager, Management Console. Each one of them do it. So here you'll notice I have a VIS server log. That actually is the most recent log, meaning that is currently what the VIS service is writing to. This log.1 was actually an older file and got wrapped. So what I mean by that is I have configured it that at 10 megabytes, once the file reaches 10 megabytes, create a new file. So it renames the current one to .1, .2, .3, etc., and create a new file, which it's currently writing to. It's almost 8 megabytes. When it reaches 10, it's going to create a VIS server.log.2 and create a new VIS server.log. So it's also configurable how many files we store on for each of those. All completely configurable. We'll go through the configurations here in a second as to how many you do. Notice that each one is for every single application. Our LDAP Manager, our Management Console, each of these applications all log to a common and consistent format. So I'm configured right now in debug mode. So let's go ahead and take a look, and what you can see just in an example. So you can see that it's saying performing an LDAP search, dynamic groups. It's getting every little bit of information about what VIS is doing. Find unused connection in the connection pool. So that's basically looking in the connection pool, finding one that's available, executing the request, gives all the detailed information about what it's doing, how long it took. So this is the type of information that we need to get to support if we have an issue. Likely, the error is going to be right there in the trace file. Take a look yourself, see if you find an error. I typically recommend going from the bottom up. So you can see right now it's doing its watchdog process. Go from the bottom up and search up for error or stack trace or stack error. Very easy to find your own error, and typically it's in pretty much plain English letting you know what the problem is. But let's go ahead and take a look. So if I was going to send off, say I have a problem that happened in my environment, I need to send off, or support told me to send off logs. First of all, highly recommend it. So if you have an issue, open up a ticket and go ahead and send in our server logs. So how would we do that? We just highlight the two files, go ahead and do a copy, and then we can send to a compressed zip file. You'll notice that those two, that's 17 megabytes, that compressed down to 707 kilobytes. So it makes it a lot easier to email over to support a zip file. Those text files, they zip up really pretty quickly, or small rather, so that you can email that over. So with that solved, that's what you would basically send over to support, the zip of all the different log files that happened. If you're able to do a clean trace, meaning it's a reproducible issue, go ahead and stop the service, delete all the current VIS server logs, start the service, replicate the behavior, and send just that. That gives us just a little bit of a cleaner file. Again, this is if it's a reproducible, easily reproducible issue that you can do yourself and isn't something that's happening out in the field. Let's go ahead and minimize that, and let me show you some of the options that you have in terms of trace logging. So I'm firing up our Management Console. This is what you use to install, manage, and configure your product. I clicked right here on Manage App Config Settings. So that's actually where these settings are for trace logging. You'll note if I come here, Optimal IdM, Virtual Identity Server bin, which is where the binaries are, and come down to the Virtual Identity Server exe.config. You can see I've made some changes actually over time. So anytime I make changes through our GUI, it's going to save it with the date timestamp and back it up. So that's nice just from a backup perspective. Let's open this up in Notepad, and you can see here's the different options. So right now the log level is set to debug. we could have debug, info, warn, error, fatal, or off. So this is pretty much from the left to the right, the most detailed to the least detailed information. Development systems, debug is what I would typically recommend. You've got the most amount of information. Anything goes wrong, you've got the errors. Fatal, error or fatal pretty much for production. So we also surface some events to the event viewer. It's also governed here by these settings here, what we send to the event viewer. So those are all documented in a document that's in the documentation folder telling you what events we do surface to the event viewer. So you can see different sizes. So here are some of these, like the maximum file size. There's that 10 megabytes that I talked about. How many we would roll back. So different settings that you can set. The most common of those settings can be set right here, where what location, where do you want it to store. By default, they all go to the trace logging folder. I pretty much recommend that, but you could send it to a different location if you wanted to. And we're doing this right now for the virtual identity server. So that's the application exe.config file that we're making the change for. So you can see we're at debug right now. So if I go ahead and choose fatal and click save, it made a change to that app config file. Let's go take a look at that and verify that it made that change. And here you go. You can see that it actually is now set to fatal. So let's cover one other piece that's very valuable. Say you have a problem that's in your environment right now. You're running in fatal, just like we are right now. Well, actually, typically it's read at startup in terms of what level VIS is running. Let's say we had restarted the service and we're up and running in fatal mode. We're in production. And an issue comes up that's happening right now, reproducible. I want to get a capture of the trace files for support. What do? You come in here to change the logging level, change it to debug, hit save. As we saw before, that made the change to the exe.config file. Problem is VIS only reads that at startup. So we've added this capability where we do reload VIS trace file. That sends a trigger over to VIS to say change your logging mechanism. So now, without a restart, which could possibly fix the problem, VIS is forced into a debug logging level. Now the logging will be more detailed, support will have more information on what your problem is and likely be able to figure it out. So the first thing I would say always is send in your trace files, hopefully in debug, and try and capture it. You could do the clean trace file that I recommended before. You can also set this for each individual application. So we could do the persisted cache, or you see select application. I can choose a given application such as the management console here. We're in that directory actually. Every single application we ship has an exe.config. We're written all in .NET, so every single application has one of these files. And notice I've got that set to error. So again, I could change it to debug as well and have the management console set to debug. Next restart of the management console and it will show up in debug mode as well. So you could do this for the LDAP manager application, any of the individual components that we sell. You can use this GUI right here to manage and maintain the tracing levels of those. So one other piece is I mentioned in some of the other videos how you can stop and start the service right here from our management console. You can do a stop, a restart clearing the trace file. So that actually goes out, and when you do the restart here, it will delete any of those VIS server.log.1, .2, any of those files would be cleared away. Really helpful if you're in dev and you want to reproduce an issue and you want cleared trace files. Just choose restart VIS service, clear the trace files. You know you're ready to go to pick up those files and send them off to support. Recommending, of course, zipping them. The view VIS trace file. That simply brings up in whatever you've configured as the default editor the trace file. So real easy. Don't have to jump out into folder file manager and choose a given folder and open up the log file. It just opens it automatically for you. So real helpful there, just in kind of speeding up the process and getting you to the place you need to know to find the errors. Thank you for watching the video, and please check out the other videos on the given topics we have.